All right, let's talk about Congress of the United States. This is an introductory lecture. It's designed to give you basic understanding of how Congress works, how it's structured, and its purpose. So, eligibility to serve in the House of Representatives is 25 years of age and citizen for 7 years. In the Senate, eligibility is 30 years and citizen for 9 years. The House of Representatives has 435 voting members, with each member representing approximately 772,000 people. This is as of 2025. The Senate has 100 senators, obviously 2 from each state. 2 times 50 equals 100. Before 1913, senators were chosen by state legislatures. Since then, they have been elected. The median age of the House member is 58.9. The median age of the senator is 63.8. This is as of 2025. One of the reasons why Congress is so much older than the average American citizen is because there are no term limits and the same people keep getting reelected over and over again. And of course, the median age of the U.S. population as a whole is 39. So much younger than the median age of either the House or the Senate. Now, members of the House serve 2-year terms and they can be reelected indefinitely. Senators serve 6-year terms. In the Senate, elections are staggered, with approximately 1/3 of senators up for re-election every 2 years. In the House, incumbency re-election rate is about 90%, and in the Senate, incumbency re-election rate is about 80%. This raises the question whether we truly have a democracy, because if the same people can get re-elected as long as they want to get re-elected, do elections really matter as much as one may assume based on nothing but theory? In theory, we have elections. In theory, anyone can be voted out of the House or the Senate. But if in practice, 90% of members of the House on average get reelected. Now, there are some years that are unusual, like 2010 or 1994, when a much more significant chunk than 10% of House members lose reelection. But if average is about 90%, is it really a democracy? With regard to some basic demographics, it's interesting to observe current numbers. Non-Hispanic whites are 58.4% of the population in the United States, but they represent 84% of the Senate and 72% of the House. Hispanics or Latinos are 19.5% of the population, but they're only 7% of the Senate and 8% of the House. African Americans are 13.7% of the population. They're 5% of the Senate and 12.4% of the House. Asian and Pacific Islanders, along with Native Hawaiians, are 6.7% of the population, but significantly underrepresented. They're only 3% of the Senate and 2.5% of the House. Then other demographics, 3.1% in the country, and as far as the House, they are about 4.4%. Native Americans / Alaskan Natives, 1.3% of the population, 1% of the Senate, 0.5% of the House of Representatives. So we see that while representation is not exactly proportionate, the House of Representatives is more or less reflective of major ethnocultural groups in the country, with the significant exception of Latinos and Asians. Latinos because they are younger than other demographics. For example, they're younger than Asians or non-Hispanic whites, and because many are non-citizens. So they have not been able to vote in proportion to their numbers in the population, and this reflects ultimately in the percentage of people elected. Some other basic information Congress, according to some, is underpaid. I agree with this assessment. As of 2025, the average member of the House and the Senate, and by this I mean really everyone who is not in an official leadership position, is paid $174,000 a year as of 2025, and so there's been no raise since 2009. That's a very long time. And some leadership positions, they're paid more, like the Speaker of the House, $223,500 a year. We have to understand that members of Congress generally have to maintain two residencies, one in Washington, D.C., and another one is back home in the state that they represent. So if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you don't even have to live in the district that you represent, but you have to live in the state where that district is located. Moreover, most members of the House actually do live in the district that they represent. So if you represent a district where housing is expensive in California and you have a home there, and you also have to live in Washington, D.C., which is also one of the more expensive places in the country, this becomes really expensive real fast. So this is why people often misunderstand how poorly Congress is remunerated. But because Congress is so unpopular, the polls show that it's pretty much always more unpopular than whoever the president is or whoever is on the Supreme Court, that members of Congress just don't get raised often enough. So they're also much more educated than the average American. In 2019, there were only 22 members of the House without at least a bachelor's degree, and all senators had at least a bachelor's degree. Now, as far as the party composition, following the November election of 2024, we had some changes. Most dramatic changes were in the Senate. In the House, the changes were almost nil. So Republicans gave up one, and Democrats gained one in the House. So as of 2025, we have 220 Republicans and 215 Democrats in the House of Representatives. So Republicans have an extremely narrow majority in the House. Now, in the Senate, Republicans have taken over many seats, and they have 53 in the Senate. Democrats have only 45 on paper, but in reality, they have 47, because the two nominal independents, Sanders of Vermont and King of Maine, are in fact Democrats. They sit with Democrats, they vote with Democrats, and they owe their positions on standing committees to Democrats. So they have branded themselves, they have styled themselves as independents, but for practical purposes, they are Democrats. So you can see the party breakdown as really being 53 to 47. A few basic terms. So the incumbent is someone who is already in office and runs for re-election. Reapportionment must happen every 10 years following the census, because the size of the House is fixed from session to session. But the populations do change, they do shift. We have seen in recent decades northeastern states, upper Midwestern states losing people, while southern and southwestern states gaining a lot of people. So every 10 years, you have to rebalance the number of representatives by state. And of course, like I said, it's done because of the census. And this is why the census is required. Redistricting also has to be done at least once every 10 years after the census. And redistricting changes the geographical shape of congressional districts. Gerrymandering is a particular form of redistricting. It's lawful in most cases. The only times where it would not be lawful is if it violates a federal law like the Voting Rights Act. if the legislature and governor gerrymander in a way which is meant to deprive protected groups, usually this means ethnic or racial groups, from the ability to elect a representative of their choice. But in all other cases, it's lawful. It's a very old practice dating back to the earliest years of the Republic. It's named after Elbridge Gerry, governor of Massachusetts, and it's a combination of two words, Gerry and salamander, because that district that he and the state legislature drew looked like a salamander, so they called it gerrymander. So that's gerrymandering. There are some states where redistricting is done by independent commissions, but the majority still do it like any state law would be made. It's a joint project between the state legislature and the governor. And of course, in many states, what you have is a one-party control. Example would be California, where for really many years you had Democrats totally dominating the state legislature, and you have had Democratic governor. So they would gerrymander congressional districts in order to benefit the Democratic Party. Now, there are states, also like South Carolina, where it goes the opposite way. It's the Republicans who gerrymander to benefit Republicans. So the dynamics is the mirror dynamics. It's just different party labels, but the idea is the same. Single-member district, simple plurality electoral system is a system of electing people into office whereby you only need more votes than anyone else, which is why it's called simple plurality. You don't even have to have a majority, just have more than anyone else. And it's called single-member district because only one person is elected per district. So the alternative would have been multiple-member district proportional representation electoral system. And this is where instead of electing one person per district, you elect multiple members per district in proportion to the popular votes that each party gets. Now, in case of the American congressional elections, because they're based on single-member district system, you end up having two major parties. Had we had multiple-member district proportional representation, then we would have ended up with multi-party system, and this is called Duverger's law, after Maurice Duverger, who was a French social scientist. So single-member district, simple plurality leads to a two-party system. Multiple-member district proportional representation leads to a multi-party system. What is a two-party system? It's a system in which only two parties, have a realistic shot at controlling the government. So it's either Democrats or Republicans. And in fact, in Congress, there's no one else. I mentioned the two independents in the Senate, Sanders and King, who are de facto Democrats, but there are no third parties elected to Congress, even though multiple minor parties are legal. There are so many of them: Libertarians, Greens, Reform, American Independent, Peace and Freedom, and so on and so forth. There are many parties operating in the United States of America, and yet only two have any representation in Congress, and only Democrats or Republicans can actually control the way the government operates because there's only two of them there. Now, if you're watching this, then you can see on your screen how Congress is organized. It's organized by committee and it's organized by party. So committees control research, oversight, and legislation, and parties control the structure, control how information and power flows within each chamber. So how can we understand these charts that respectively represent organization of Congress by committee and by party? Let's kind of cover some of these basic terms and it will become very clear. Standing committees are permanent legislative bodies of Congress. So each consists of between 6 and 50 members. And subcommittees can be created to add additional specialization, but subcommittees report to the overall committee. And the most powerful person on each committee is the committee chair. And then you have committee ranking members. And the purpose of standing committees is to actually write laws. They are the legislative engine of Congress. And they're called permanent because once created, they will continue to exist indefinitely until and unless Congress restructures them or gets rid of them. Okay, so once created, they roll over indefinitely from one session of Congress to another. And again, their purpose is to do legislative work. Now, the committee chair of each standing committee always belongs to whichever party has majority in that chamber. So if you were to look in 2025 at the House of Representatives, the committee chair would be Republican in the House, and every standing committee chair would also be Republican in the Senate, because in the House and in the Senate, Republicans have a majority. Ranking members are also senior members, and they belong to both political parties. Select committees do not legislate, they do research and issue reports, and once they do that, they typically dissolve. So they would investigate specific issues like, why did security fail on 9/11? What was the problem? So there's like a specific issue that is delegated to them. They research it, they issue reports. Now, we also have joint committees. A joint committee is any committee that has members of both the House and the Senate. The most crucial, I would say, of the joint committees is a conference committee. So a conference committee is a type of joint committee, and its purpose is to reconcile the differences between the House and the Senate versions of a bill. So when a bill passes the House and the Senate, it will not have exactly the same verbiage, even though the purpose is the same, because the House and the Senate are two very different legislative bodies with different purposes and different priorities, different dynamics. So the bill will differ. And if conference committee can work out a compromise verbiage, then this compromise verbiage goes back to each chamber, and then each chamber has to vote again. And if it votes, then it becomes ready to go to president for his signature. So, in the House, one person may not serve on more than 2 standing committees, and for subcommittees, waivers can be granted to serve on additional committees. In the Senate, senators may not serve on more than 3 standing committees and 5 subcommittees. Waivers can be granted to serve on additional committees. Now, the partisan composition of each standing committee roughly reflects the partisan breakdown of the entire chamber in which that committee is located. So I say roughly because it's impossible to do so exactly in proportion to partisan composition, because there are, in fact, other variables in determining who serves on each committee, most notably the preference of each member of Congress. At the beginning of each new Congress, that is to say during the first week of January of odd-numbered years, members express their preference for committee assignments. Members' preferences depend on the state or district that they represent. Committees in each chamber assigns members to committees. Members who already serve on a particular committee almost always ask to continue to serve on that committee because they accumulate seniority, which determines whether they can become ranking members or even eventually committee chair. The House Republican Steering Committee appoints House Republicans to committees. The Steering and Policy Committee appoints House Democrats to committees. The Speaker of the House is the most powerful person in the House. He or she controls the schedule and serves as the liaison between the White House and the House of Representatives, because the president is the chief legislator and the president needs to know what can and cannot pass in the House. So Congress does not usually start from scratch. The vast majority of bills that become law start with president and or his advisors. So the president is the initiator, but the president has to be realistic about what can pass the House. And so the speaker is the connection between the president and the rest of the House. The majority leader serves as the speaker in the absence of the speaker, if the speaker is ill or the speaker is traveling, and is also the connection between the speaker and majority whip. So the role of the majority whip is to make sure that the majority caucus shows up to vote when the vote is scheduled, and the majority whip is the connection between rank and file and the leadership being the Speaker of the House and Majority Leader. So the whip has to communicate to rank and file the way that the leadership wants rank and file to vote, but you see, the leadership cannot force the rank and file to vote the way it wants them to vote. It can suggest, it can cajole, it can hold committee assignments over their heads, but it cannot really force them. There's no mechanism, there's no obligation for rank and file to vote the way the leadership wants them to vote. And so the whip really connects rank and file to the majority and tells the majority the mood of the rank and file, who the stragglers are, who does not want to vote with the majority, and so on and so forth. Now, on the minority side, there's minority leader. So if minority becomes majority as a result of the next election, almost always minority leader will be elected speaker by the formerly minority caucus that becomes a majority. House minority whip does for the minority the same thing that the House majority whip does for the majority, and then you have minority rank and file. In the Senate, you have a structure which is resembling the House. So the majority leader in the Senate is the most powerful person. He or she controls the schedule in the Senate. If the majority leader does not want a particular bill to become law, he will not even schedule it for vote, and it will die. Now, you also have Senate majority whip. Again, same kind of function as the whip would serve in the House. And then you have majority rank and file. And again, just like in the House, you also have the mirror party dynamics in the Senate. You have minority leader, minority whip, and minority rank and file. Vice President of the United States is constitutionally the President of the Senate, but he or she typically does not preside over the Senate. He or she will only appear in the Senate to break a tie vote, and that's it. So Vice President does not participate with senators on policy dynamics, completely stays out of that. So who presides over the Senate? Now, the Constitution says that the next in line to preside is President pro tem of the Senate, which is a symbolic position typically given to a very senior senator, but very often President pro tem of the Senate will not actually preside over the Senate. And, well, who does that then? Usually some kind of junior member, let's say freshman senator, who is given his power or her power that way, and just every once in a while, that junior senator will pound the gavel and will say, the Senate will come to order. So this is how they make them feel powerful, feel important. Some other basic terms that we have to understand about legislative dynamics in Congress: log rolling, filibustering, and cloture. Now, I want to remind you, in case you have forgotten, that committees, standing committees, are really the engines of the legislative process in Congress. And if the committee that is charged with a particular bill does not want that bill passed, it will kill it by refusing to report it to the floor. It will simply not act on it, and it will die in that committee. Technically, there's a way to pry a bill out of the committee, but that's almost never done. There's a great deal of difference between committees. So there's a great deal of deference to the committee process. And of course, the other side of this coin is that if a committee votes to pass a particular bill, it reports this bill to the House with the yes recommendation, and the House will almost certainly pass it. And the same dynamic happens in the Senate. So the rule of thumb is what the committee says goes, right? Not always, but that's the rule of thumb. The vast majority of cases, whatever the standing committee decides, that will be the fate of any given bill. Which is why most bargaining and compromising, which is called log rolling, happens in standing committees. So this is an old pioneer term when the pioneers were building log cabins. I'll help you if you help me. I will vote for your provision of the bill if you'll support my provision of the bill. So filibustering is the other side of the coin, and filibustering only happens in the Senate. So filibustering technically means talking an issue to death. In case of the senatorial dynamics, is you talk until time runs out and the bill dies. A determined minority of 41 out of 100 can filibuster a bill to death in the Senate, and you need supermajority of 60 to invoke what is known as cloture, and cloture ends filibuster, and then you can vote. The Senate can actually take a vote on a bill. Now, I say that filibustering is the other side of the coin from log rolling, because filibustering typically happens when some powerful senators or some faction or some particular interest did not get what it wanted, and that's why it's filibustering. So earmarks, also known as special projects, also known as pork barrel, these are types of spending that benefit a narrow constituency, like a particular district or a particular state, but have no tangible benefit to anyone else in the country. So the so-called DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, which Donald Trump announced after he won the 2024 election with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, obviously that's not a real department. That's just kind of a symbolic name for it. What that really is a kitchen cabinet, an informal group of presidential advisors. Anyway, I bring this up because earmarks are often blamed for overspending, and I would suggest that maybe some earmarks are wasteful, but they're not the reason why the United States of America is drowning in debt. Not at all. The real reason is big spending ticket items, which take up 80% of the budget, which is defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, entitlement programs, and interest on the debt. That's about 80% of the budget. Non-germane provisions are provisions that are not relevant to a particular bill. That is to say, the bill could be about national defense, but there may be a line in it which subsidizes agriculture, in Iowa. And so you can get an irrelevant or non-germane provision, and these provisions are often ways to sneak in earmarks or special projects. Line item veto is unconstitutional. So Congress actually wanted President to have line item veto, and it even gave this power to Bill Clinton, but it was shut down by the Supreme Court, who said that can't do it, because if you allow the president to literally veto specific line items and yet sign the rest of the bill, then that makes the president a part of the legislative branch, formally makes him part of the legislative branch, which cannot be done because it violates separation of powers. So never mind the fact that, informally, for practical, informal purposes, the president really does drive the legislative agenda. What you cannot do is to make it formal, to formalize it. You cannot allow him and eventually her to veto specific items and yet sign the rest of the bill, because that makes president very much like a legislator. So like I said, most bills that become law, they start with the president. Upwards of 90% or so. Congress almost never starts from scratch. Now, what if the president does not want a particular law to be signed? What happens if Congress is in one of those rare cases, one of those rare instances, passes a law without presidential leadership, and it's a law that president does not want? He obviously has a right to veto it. And then the question becomes, can Congress muster two-thirds supermajority to override the veto? And statistically, the likeliest answer is no, because statistically only 4% of presidents' vetoes have been overridden, from George Washington through Donald Trump. So it really is a very, very uphill battle. So if president does not want a particular bill to become law, statistically there's 96% chance that it will not become law. He will simply veto it. Budget. Now, why do I talk about the budget when I talk about Congress? It is often said that Congress has the power of the purse, but we have to understand that for practical purposes, the federal budget is a joint project between Congress and the president because budget is law. And fiscal year, that is to say budget year, begins on the 1st of October and ends on the 30th of September. So if the budget is not done on time, some parts of the government may be shut down, like non-essential parts, and others will continue to function based on so-called continuing resolutions, which will appropriate money for these specific parts and programs of the government. When the president delivers his State of the Union address, which typically happens last week of January or first week of February, he signals his priorities. And this is a sign for Congress to become alert, to listen closely as to where he might want to increase or decrease spending. And then in February, sometime in February, he submits his budget proposal to Congress. Congress has until May to come up with a counter proposal to take out what it doesn't want to pass and include what it does want to pass. And then they have until the last day of September to hopefully come to a compromise. And sometimes they don't, especially in recent decades. But like I said, all this posturing over government shutdown, it tends to be more theatrics and minor disruption than substance. Okay? Authorization versus appropriation. Authorization is how much money is legally authorized, and appropriation is how much is actually dispersed, how much is actually spent. Appropriations typically tend to be less than authorizations. Now, how does Congress actually work, right? How does it function? What do members of Congress actually reflect? Do they reflect the will of the constituents, or do they reflect their own will, their own judgment about what's right or wrong? Or are they perhaps chameleons who sometimes reflect the preferences of their constituents and sometimes reflect the preferences of their own, conscience? So the trustee model says that they actually represent their own conscience. They listen to what the constituents want, but ultimately they're not robots. They may decide to do something else, something different, even if it's against what the majority of the constituents truly wants. Now, the delegate description of what members of Congress do says, no, they actually are robots, and they reflect pretty much 100% what the constituents want. And the political model says they are chameleons. Sometimes they act like trustees, and sometimes they act like robots. Question is, where is the truth? Who is right? Another question is, who are the constituents? Please note, so far I didn't say voters, I said constituents. And the reason why is because voters are not the only constituents. You know who else is the constituents? Donors. You cannot run for Congress empty pockets, with empty pockets. You need to have a lot of money in order to be assured of winning a Senate seat. Even if you are already an incumbent, you have to be able to raise millions of dollars. Even if you don't spend it all, and in the end you return some, you have to be able to raise millions of dollars. And in the House, it's less than that, but it's still, you still have to raise a lot of money. And that's why answering the question, do they really do the bidding of their constituents exactly like robots? Or do they actually use their own judgment, is an unanswerable question, because there's no agreement on who the constituents really are or should be. Now, I think that for practical purposes, we can say that both donors and voters are constituents. But who is more influential, if any, of these two groups? I would say it's the donors. I would say that the United States is in its function, more of an oligarchy ruled by the few, while in appearance as a facade, it's a representative democracy, and it is the voters, the people, who vote and who determine who the representatives will be, and thus determine who will be in power. And because they determine it, the people as a whole are in power. So I would suggest that well-heeled, well-connected, skilled numerical minorities who can donate a lot of money, who know a lot about politics, and who are extremely focused on one or two interests that they have, who are not distracted by sports, entertainment, etc., they are the ones that hold the bulk of the power. But nevertheless, we can still generalize a little bit and say the following. In the House of Representatives, members tend to act more like delegates, that is to say, more like robots, precisely because elections are so frequent. And they tend to reflect what the donors and the voters want pretty much exactly. In the Senate, they have the luxury of being trustees or politico, because if they take a position that's unpopular with either the donors or the voters, and the next election is not until 5 or 6 years away, this transgression, so-called, may be forgotten. So in the Senate, senators are much freer to exercise their own conscience than members of the House have in the House. And thanks for listening. I hope you learned a lot about how Congress of the United States works.